Inner peace is found in your silence, Buddhist wisdom. In every age and culture, humanity has sought the elusive treasure of inner peace. It is the stillness that cannot be bought, the quietness that cannot be forced, and the calmness that no external chaos can steal away. In the teachings of Buddhism, silence is not merely the absence of words or noise. It is a doorway into the depths of consciousness, a sacred space where truth is revealed and suffering dissolves. The mind, so often restless, filled with worries about yesterday and anxieties about tomorrow, finds its healing only when immersed in silence. The Buddha taught that our suffering does not come from the world outside, but from the way our mind clings, resists, and reacts. When the mind becomes silent, not through repression but through awareness, it ceases to struggle against reality. It begins to flow with life instead of against it. That silence is not emptiness but fullness. It is alive, radiant, and filled with wisdom. This text will explore 5 vast dimensions of silence as taught through Buddhist wisdom. Each dimension reveals not only why silence leads to inner peace, but also how one can practice and embody it in daily life. The journey begins with understanding silence as the foundation of clarity, continues with silence as a healing force, expands into silence as a teacher, deepens into silence as compassion, and culminates in silence as liberation. In walking through these reflections, we are not asked to renounce the world, but to see it through new eyes, to recognize that silence is not about withdrawal, but about presence. To discover that within silence, life speaks in ways more profound than words can capture. Let us begin this journey with the first revelation, silence as the ground of clarity, where the mind ceases its endless chatter and reveals the truth of reality. Silence as the ground of clarity. When the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree, his victory over suffering was not achieved through endless debate or argument, nor through the constant movement of thought. It was attained in silence. In that deep stillness, the illusions of the mind dissolved, and truth revealed itself as effortlessly as the sun emerging after the clouds part. This is the essence of Buddhist teaching. Clarity arises not through accumulation of noise, but through the surrender to silence. The human mind is like a lake. When winds of thought, desire, and fear stir its waters, the surface is disturbed and we cannot see beneath. Yet when the winds calm, the lake reflects everything clearly: the sky, the trees, the moon, the stars. In the same way, silence calms the storms of the mind, allowing clarity to arise. This is why meditation is not simply a practice of concentration, but a practice of silence. By sitting quietly, observing without judgment, we allow the mind to rest in its natural state. Modern life, however, teaches us the opposite. We are trained to value constant speech, endless activity, and continuous stimulation. We believe that to be silent is to be unproductive, to be still is to waste time, to pause is to fall behind. But Buddhist wisdom reverses this conditioning. It reminds us that true understanding, true wisdom, and true peace are born in silence. The endless chatter of the mind does not bring clarity, it clouds it. The restless search for answers through words and arguments does not reveal the truth, it hides it. To experience silence as clarity, one must first recognize the noise that dominates the mind. This noise is not just the sound of the external world, but the inner turbulence of thought. Each thought carries with it judgment, attachment, or resistance. We think about what we desire, what we fear, what we regret, and what we hope for. These thoughts build layer upon layer of illusion, preventing us from seeing reality as it is. Silence cuts through these layers. Consider how often our decisions are clouded by inner noise. We are torn between what society expects and what our heart longs for. We listen to voices of fear, doubt, and desire, and in doing so, we lose clarity. But when we enter silence, true silence, not forced quietness, but deep awareness, we touch the ground of clarity. Suddenly, we see without distortion. We understand not through analysis, but through direct experience. the truth becomes self-evident. This is why silence is often called the mother of wisdom. Without silence, we react blindly to life, driven by impulses and conditioned patterns. With silence, we respond consciously, seeing reality as it is, not as we imagine it to be. Silence reveals the impermanence of all things, the interconnectedness of all beings, and the futility of clinging to what changes. In this way, silence becomes the ground upon which clarity is built. The practice of silence requires patience. In the beginning, when one sits in meditation, the noise of the mind may grow louder. Thoughts rush in like uninvited guests, memories resurface, desires arise, fears whisper. Many abandon silence at this point, believing it is impossible to quiet the mind. But Buddhist wisdom teaches that silence is not the absence of thought, but the space in which thought arises and dissolves. By observing thoughts without clinging to them, we gradually discover the silence beneath them. In the silence of clarity, even suffering transforms. What once appeared unbearable becomes understood. What once seemed permanent reveals itself as fleeting. What once appeared as chaos is seen as a natural unfolding of causes and conditions. The mind no longer resists, it accepts, and in acceptance there is peace. This is the first step in discovering that inner peace is found in silence. It is to realize that silence is not an escape, but a foundation, not emptiness, but clarity. To enter silence is to enter truth. To remain in silence is to remain in peace. And to live from silence is to live in harmony with the flow of life itself. If you are beginning this journey, let this be your first practice. Set aside a few minutes each day to simply sit in silence. Not to control, not to analyze, not to judge, just to observe. Notice the thoughts that come and go, the feelings that arise and pass, the sensations that change moment by moment. Beneath it all, discover the silence that is always present, waiting to be recognized. Silence is not something we create. It is something we uncover. It is the natural state of the mind when it is no longer entangled in illusions. It is the clarity that arises when the winds of thought no longer disturb the lake of consciousness. And it is in this clarity that we begin to glimpse inner peace. So as you reflect on these words, remember, silence is the ground of clarity. It is the doorway through which all wisdom enters. It is the beginning of the journey toward inner peace. If this teaching resonates with you, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so that together we can continue exploring the profound wisdom that silence offers to the heart and mind. Silence as a healing force. Silence has often been misunderstood as a void, a lifeless emptiness where nothing happens. Yet in the depth of Buddhist wisdom, silence is not barren but fertile, not empty but overflowing with potential. It is in silence that healing takes place, both for the body and the mind, for the wounds we carry from the past and the anxieties we project onto the future. Healing, in the Buddhist sense, is not merely the absence of pain, but the restoration of wholeness. It is the reconciliation of the mind with the reality of life, the acceptance of impermanence, and the recognition that peace is always available when we cease struggling against what is. In silence, the fragmented self begins to mend, and the restless heart begins to rest. When we look at the human condition, we see a pattern of constant seeking. People are restless, running after pleasure, running away from pain, endlessly moving in search of something that will heal their inner wounds. But external pursuits rarely bring the healing they seek. They may soothe for a moment, like a temporary balm, but soon the ache returns and the search begins again. This cycle of craving and disappointment, of chasing and despair, is what Buddhism calls samsara, the endless wheel of suffering. The Buddha's insight was that healing cannot be found in the external world, but must arise from within, through awareness, through stillness, through silence. Think for a moment about the nature of pain, whether physical or emotional. Pain speaks loudly in the mind. It demands attention, creates stories, and builds layers of resistance. When we are hurt, the mind magnifies the wound with thoughts such as, "This should not have happened to me," or "I cannot bear this." These thoughts amplify the pain into suffering. Yet when we rest in silence, we learn to observe pain without resistance, to sit with it without adding layers of judgment or fear. In that quiet observation, something remarkable happens. Pain begins to lose its grip. It remains as a sensation, but the suffering attached to it begins to dissolve. Silence does not erase pain, but transforms our relationship with it. And in that transformation, healing arises. The practice of mindfulness, central to Buddhist meditation, is essentially a practice of silence. It is the cultivation of a still awareness that does not interfere, does not resist, and does not cling. In silence, we begin to see the impermanence of every sensation, every thought, every emotion. What seemed unbearable becomes bearable when we recognize that it will pass. What seemed overwhelming loses its power when seen in the light of awareness. Silence allows us to stop fighting with reality, and in that surrender, the mind begins to heal. Healing, then, is not something we force, but something that happens naturally when the mind returns to silence. This healing power of silence is not abstract. It has been witnessed in countless lives. A person who carries the trauma of childhood, haunted by memories of pain and rejection, may spend years trying to numb themselves through distraction, through substances, through relationships, through work. Yet nothing fully heals. But when they learn to sit quietly, to observe their wounds without running from them, they discover that silence can embrace even their deepest pain. Silence does not judge, silence does not condemn, silence simply holds. And in that holding, the wound begins to close, not by forgetting or denying, but by accepting and integrating. Similarly, one who suffers from anxiety finds that silence is the medicine the world could not offer. Anxiety thrives on noise, the noise of "what if," the noise of "I cannot handle this," the noise of endless scenarios created by the restless mind. When such a person learns to sit in silence, even for a few minutes, they discover that anxiety loses its fuel. Silence interrupts the cycle of thought, breaks the momentum of fear, and allows the mind to breathe. The body relaxes, the heart slows, the breath deepens. The anxious storm quiets, not because the external world has changed, but because the inner world has touched silence. This is why Buddhist monasteries have long embraced silence not as punishment but as healing. Silence, in such places, is not imposed repression, but a compassionate container in which the mind can settle. The stillness of the environment, the absence of constant chatter, the gentle rhythm of mindful living, all of these allow wounds to heal. People who enter such silence often report that at first it is unbearable because the noise within becomes louder. Yet over time, as the mind adjusts, they begin to feel lighter, freer, and more whole. The silence that once felt heavy now feels like liberation. The very act of sitting in silence becomes a medicine for the soul. Science, in recent decades, has begun to confirm what Buddhist wisdom has taught for centuries. Studies show that silence reduces stress, lowers blood pressure, enhances the immune system, and promotes overall well-being. When the nervous system is no longer bombarded with noise and constant stimulation, it naturally shifts into a state of balance. The body begins to repair itself. The mind begins to restore itself. Silence, in this way, is not only a spiritual practice, but also a profound form of self-care. It nourishes both the visible body and the invisible soul. But silence heals not only individuals, it also heals relationships. How often do conflicts escalate because of words spoken in haste? How often do relationships break because silence was feared and people felt compelled to fill the space with arguments, accusations, or defensiveness? Silence, when embraced, allows space for understanding. In silence, we listen not only to others but also to ourselves. We hear the pain beneath the anger, the longing beneath the harsh words, the fear beneath the defensiveness. Silence gives us the patience to respond instead of react, the compassion to see beyond the surface, the clarity to recognize the humanity in the other. Imagine two people in conflict. Words have been exchanged, wounds have been deepened, and both feel unheard. If they pause, even for a few moments, to sit in silence together, something shifts. The tension softens, the energy changes, and suddenly what felt impossible begins to feel possible again. This is not magic, it is the natural healing power of silence. Silence creates space for truth to emerge without the distortion of anger or fear. Silence heals what words cannot. In the same way, silence heals our relationship with nature. In the rush of modern life, people often pass through the world without truly seeing it, without hearing the wind, without feeling the earth beneath their feet. But when we enter silence, the world begins to speak. The trees whisper, the rivers sing, the mountains breathe. We begin to feel connected again, not as conquerors of nature, but as part of it. This reconnection is healing, for much of our suffering arises from the illusion of separation, from believing we are cut off from life, alone in our struggles. Silence dissolves this illusion and restores our sense of belonging. Perhaps the deepest healing that silence brings is the healing of the self-image. Many people live imprisoned by their own inner voices, voices of criticism, judgment, and comparison. These voices say, "You are not enough, you have failed, you must do more." These voices are loud, constant, and wounding. But when we enter silence, these voices begin to fade. They may still arise, but in silence we see them for what they are, just thoughts, not truth. The self that was fractured by judgment begins to heal in the presence of silence, for silence holds no judgment. Silence accepts us as we are, without conditions. It is in this unconditional acceptance that true healing occurs. Healing in silence does not mean that life becomes free of challenges. Illness may still come, loss may still visit, pain may still arise. But the difference is in how we meet them. In silence, we meet life with equanimity. We allow what comes to come and what goes to go. We no longer fight with the flow of existence, but move with it. In this movement, even suffering becomes a teacher, and every wound becomes a doorway to wisdom. This is the healing power of silence. It does not erase life's difficulties, but transforms our relationship with them, turning poison into medicine, wounds into wisdom, pain into peace. One might ask, how can this healing silence be cultivated in daily life, especially in a noisy world? The answer lies not in escaping life, but in creating moments of intentional silence. Begin the day with silence before speaking, before checking messages, before immersing in the world. Allow a few breaths to settle into awareness. Throughout the day, pause for silent moments. Walking without headphones, eating without distraction, sitting quietly between tasks. End the day again in silence, allowing the mind to release the burdens of the day. These small acts of silence accumulate, and over time, they begin to heal the restless mind, the wounded heart, and the weary soul. Buddhism teaches that every being carries within themselves the potential for awakening, the seed of Buddha nature. This seed needs silence to grow, just as a seed in the soil needs stillness to sprout. If constantly disturbed, it cannot flourish. But when given silence, it begins to awaken and healing blossoms naturally. Thus, silence is not only a personal practice, but also a universal medicine, available to all, regardless of culture or belief. As we continue this journey into the wisdom of silence, let us remember that healing is not something we achieve, but something we allow. The mind heals when it stops fighting. The heart heals when it stops resisting. The soul heals when it stops running. Silence is the space where this allowing happens, the gentle soil in which the broken parts of ourselves find their way back into wholeness. If you have walked with me through these reflections, take a moment now to pause, to breathe, to sit in silence even for a short while. Notice how silence feels not heavy but light, not empty but full. Notice how even in these few moments, healing begins to take root. And as you continue this journey, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, so together we may keep exploring the profound healing power of silence as taught through the timeless wisdom of Buddhism. Silence as a teacher. Silence is not only the ground of clarity and the space of healing, but it is also the most profound of teachers. Throughout Buddhist history, some of the greatest lessons were transmitted without words, not through elaborate scriptures or intellectual discourse, but through silence itself. Silence teaches directly, without the need for translation, without the interference of language, and without the distortions of interpretation. It is immediate, intimate, and undeniable. When we learn to listen to silence, we discover that it speaks more eloquently than the loudest voice, more clearly than the most precise argument, and more compassionately than the kindest counsel. Silence, in its purest form, becomes a teacher that guides us toward awakening. The Buddha himself often used silence as instruction. There are many accounts in the sutras where the Buddha, when asked a certain question, would remain silent. Some disciples were confused by this, wondering why he would not answer, but the silence itself was the answer. When a question arose from a place of ignorance, speculation, or attachment, words would only feed the delusion. Silence cut through illusion without feeding it. The silence of the Buddha was not neglect, but profound wisdom. It invited the seeker to look beyond the surface of thought and into the depth of awareness. That silence continues to echo through time, reminding us that the deepest truths cannot be confined to words. To understand silence as a teacher, one must first recognize the limitations of words. Language, while useful, is inherently dualistic. It divides reality into subject and object, self and other, right and wrong, good and bad. Words point to reality, but they are not reality itself. To mistake the finger pointing at the moon for the moon is to remain in ignorance. Silence bypasses this limitation. It does not point, it reveals. In silence, we experience reality directly, without the filter of concepts. This direct experience is the essence of wisdom. When one sits in meditation, silence becomes the teacher in subtle but powerful ways. At first, silence teaches patience, for the restless mind resists stillness. The practitioner learns that silence cannot be forced, it must be allowed. This patience itself is a lesson, that growth does not happen on demand, but unfolds naturally. Next, silence teaches awareness, as the practitioner begins to notice the flow of thoughts, the rise and fall of emotions, the sensations in the body. This awareness deepens over time, teaching the truth of impermanence, that all phenomena arise and pass away. Finally, silence teaches non-attachment, for as one observes without clinging, one realizes that nothing in the mind or body is permanent, and thus there is nothing to grasp. Each of these lessons arises not through words, but through direct encounter with silence. Zen Buddhism especially emphasizes the role of silence as a teacher. A master may respond to a student's question with a gesture, a shout, or complete silence. These responses are not evasions, but direct teachings, designed to awaken the student beyond the limits of rational thought. In Zen, silence is sometimes referred to as the lion's roar, because it is silence that cuts through delusion with the greatest power. The paradox is that silence, which seems passive, is in fact the most active force for awakening. In silence, the mind cannot rely on old patterns, cannot cling to familiar concepts, cannot hide behind excuses. It is confronted directly with itself, and in that confrontation, truth emerges. Consider how silence teaches humility. In a world where people are trained to prove themselves, to defend their opinions, and to assert their importance, silence strips away the need for validation. When one sits in silence, there is no one to impress, no argument to win, no recognition to seek. One is simply present. This presence reveals that much of what we cling to, titles, roles, identities, are constructions of the mind. Silence teaches that we are not our stories, not our labels, not our masks. We are something deeper, something prior to words. This humility is not self-deprecation, but liberation, for it frees us from the burden of maintaining illusions. Silence also teaches us to listen. Most people hear, but few truly listen. Listening requires silence, not only external silence, but internal silence. To listen fully is to quiet the mind's judgments, to suspend the rush to respond, to be fully present with what is. In this way, silence teaches empathy. When we listen in silence, we begin to understand others not only through their words, but through their pauses, their tone, their presence. Silence allows us to hear what is unspoken, the cries behind the smiles, the longings behind the anger, the humanity beneath the masks. In this way, silence teaches compassion, for when we truly listen, we cannot help but care. But silence as a teacher is not limited to meditation halls or spiritual practice. It is available in every moment of life. Nature, in its essence, is a silent teacher. Sit by a river, and silence teaches the flow of impermanence. Watch the sky, and silence teaches vastness. Observe a tree, and silence teaches patience. Walk in a forest, and silence teaches interconnectedness. These lessons are not spoken, yet they are understood. The silence of nature reveals truths that words cannot capture. The more we immerse ourselves in such silence, the more we learn without trying, the more wisdom seeps into us effortlessly. One of the greatest lessons silence teaches is the futility of control. The mind constantly seeks to control circumstances, to control others, to control outcomes. This control arises from fear, the fear that life will not unfold as we desire. But silence teaches us that control is an illusion. When we sit in silence, we realize that thoughts come and go on their own. We do not summon them, nor can we stop them at will. They arise, they pass. The breath flows in and out without our command. The heart beats without our effort. Life unfolds naturally, and silence reveals this truth. The lesson is profound. We are not the controllers of life, but participants in its unfolding. To surrender to this realization is to find peace. Another lesson silence teaches is the nature of self. In silence, when the noise of thought subsides, we begin to ask, who am I? Am I these thoughts? Am I these emotions? Am I this body? Silence reveals that the self we cling to is fluid, changing, impermanent. The identity we defend so fiercely is a collection of memories, habits, and roles, none of which remain constant. In silence, we experience a deeper self, one not defined by labels, one not limited by stories. This deeper self is vast, spacious, and free. Silence teaches us that we are not the wave but the ocean, not the passing thought but the awareness in which thought arises. This lesson cannot be taught by words alone. It must be experienced in silence. Silence also teaches us the art of letting go. When the mind is noisy, it clings desperately to ideas, to possessions, to relationships, to beliefs. In silence, we see how clinging creates suffering. We notice how the mind tries to hold on to each thought, each sensation, each moment, and we see how impossible this is. Nothing stays, everything flows. Silence teaches us to let go, not by force, but by understanding. Letting go becomes natural when we realize that holding on is futile, and in letting go, we find freedom. It is worth noting that silence does not teach through comfort alone. Sometimes silence is uncomfortable, even painful. When we first enter silence, all the suppressed emotions, the forgotten wounds, the denied fears arise to the surface. This is also part of silence's teaching. It shows us what we have avoided, what we have buried. It forces us to face ourselves honestly. This honesty is painful but necessary. Only by facing the shadow can we integrate it. Only by acknowledging the wound can we heal it. Silence teaches us to stop running from ourselves. It holds up a mirror, and in that mirror we see both our darkness and our light. This is perhaps one of silence's most valuable lessons, that healing requires courage, and courage grows only in silence. The role of silence as a teacher can also be seen in the great traditions of Buddhist monastic life. Monks often spend long periods in silence, sometimes years. This is not to deprive them of human connection, but to allow silence to teach them directly. In silence, the mind reveals its patterns, its illusions, its desires, its fears. Over time, these patterns lose their power, and the monk begins to see reality as it is. Words can explain this, but they cannot substitute for the experience. Silence teaches by allowing the direct encounter with truth. In modern times, silence remains a teacher for those who seek. Amidst the constant bombardment of information, the endless noise of media, the pressure of opinions, silence stands as a rare sanctuary. Those who enter it, even briefly, discover lessons that no book or lecture can provide. Silence teaches us to pause before reacting, to see before judging, to breathe before rushing. It teaches us to honor the present moment, to value simplicity, to embrace stillness. These lessons, though simple, are profound, and they change the way we live. Silence teaches us that happiness is not in the future, but in the now. The mind constantly seeks fulfillment in what is yet to come, in achievements, in possessions, in relationships, in recognition. But silence teaches that peace is already here, in the breath, in the present moment. The constant chase is unnecessary. The treasure is within. This realization changes everything. We no longer exhaust ourselves in pursuit of happiness, but rest in the happiness of being. Silence teaches contentment, and in contentment we find joy. Finally, silence teaches us to trust life. The mind fears uncertainty, clinging to plans and strategies, desperate to secure outcomes. But silence reveals that life unfolds with its own wisdom. Just as a flower blooms without effort, just as the sun rises without command, so too does life move in its rhythm. Silence teaches us to trust this rhythm, to surrender to it. This trust dissolves fear, and with fear dissolved, peace arises. Thus silence is not only the background of wisdom, but the active teacher of it. It instructs us in clarity, in patience, in humility, in compassion, in courage, in letting go, in trust. Each lesson comes not from outside, but from within, revealed in the quiet of the heart. To embrace silence is to sit at the feet of the most profound teacher, one who never uses words, yet whose teaching transforms the soul. So as you reflect on these truths, take time to sit with silence, not as an absence, but as a presence, not as emptiness, but as fullness. Let silence be your teacher, guiding you toward wisdom, compassion, and freedom. And as you continue this journey, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, so that together we can keep learning from the silent teacher that has guided seekers of truth for centuries. Silence as compassion. Silence, when truly understood, is not a withdrawal from the world, nor a rejection of human connection. Rather, it is the deepest form of connection, the essence of compassion made manifest in stillness. In Buddhist wisdom, compassion is not only an act of kindness, but an understanding of the suffering of others and the willingness to alleviate that suffering. Silence, paradoxically, is one of the most powerful expressions of compassion, for it is in silence that we learn to listen, to embrace, to hold space, and to love without conditions. When silence is imbued with awareness, it ceases to be emptiness and becomes presence, and presence is the heart of compassion. To understand silence as compassion, one must first grasp that compassion is not limited to action. We often think of compassion as doing something, offering help, giving comfort, speaking words of encouragement. These are important expressions, but they are not the essence of compassion. True compassion arises from the heart's silence, from the ability to be fully with another without judgment, without agenda, without the need to fix or change. Compassion is presence, and silence is the soil in which presence blooms. In silence, we meet others as they are, not as we want them to be, and this unconditional acceptance is the foundation of compassion. Consider how often in life people suffer not because no one is around, but because no one is truly present. Someone may be surrounded by friends, colleagues, even family, yet feel utterly alone because no one is listening. Conversations are filled with noise, opinions, judgments, advice, but the heart longs for silence, for someone to simply be there. When another person offers silence, not as neglect but as attentive presence, something remarkable happens. The suffering one feels seen, understood, embraced. This is compassion through silence. It does not demand words, it does not rush to solutions, it simply says, "I am here with you." That presence is healing beyond measure. The Buddha taught that compassion, or karuna, is born from the recognition of suffering. To see that all beings suffer, to feel that suffering in one's own heart, and to respond with care, this is compassion. Silence deepens this recognition, for in silence we listen beyond the surface. We hear the sorrow in another's tone, the pain in their pauses, the longing in their silence. Words can deceive, but silence reveals. In silence we learn to sense what is unspoken, and in sensing we respond not to appearances but to truth. This is why silence is compassion. It allows us to see suffering as it truly is and to meet it with presence rather than pretense. Silence as compassion is also an act of humility. When we rush to fill silence with words, it is often because we believe we know what is best, that we have the solution, that our perspective must be shared. But compassion does not impose. It listens. Silence teaches us that our presence is more valuable than our opinions. It reminds us that we do not need to fix everything, for not everything can be fixed. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can offer is to sit in silence with another, to share their burden simply by not abandoning them to it. This humility is profound, for it dissolves the ego's need to be right, to be helpful, to be important. It allows love to flow without obstruction. In meditation practice, silence cultivates compassion within us by revealing our own suffering. At first, when we enter silence, we confront our pain, our fears, our insecurities. We may resist, but over time, silence softens the heart. We see that our suffering is not unique, but part of the human condition. We begin to recognize our pain in others, and their pain in us. This recognition births compassion. When we realize that the anger of another is rooted in their suffering, that their harsh words are cries for help, that their coldness is a shield against their own wounds, we no longer react with hostility. Instead, we respond with compassion. Silence teaches us this lesson by stripping away illusions and revealing the shared vulnerability of all beings. Imagine sitting with a friend who has lost someone they love. Words often fail in such moments. Attempts to explain, to comfort, to rationalize can feel hollow or even painful. But silence, when offered with presence, becomes the deepest comfort. Sitting together in silence, holding hands, breathing in the same stillness, this says more than words ever could. It says, "I share your sorrow. I am with you in this darkness. You are not alone." This silent companionship is compassion in its purest form. The same is true in the practice of listening. When we listen in silence, we offer others the gift of being fully heard. Most people do not truly listen. They wait to reply. They prepare their response. They judge. They compare. But compassionate silence is different. It is empty of agenda, open, receptive. It allows the other to unfold, to express, to release. In this way, silence becomes not only a teacher but a healer, for to be heard is to be healed. Compassion through silence is not passive. It is the active work of the heart, creating space where another can simply be. Silence, as compassion, also extends beyond human interaction to our relationship with all beings. The world is filled with the suffering of animals, of forests cut down, of rivers polluted, of ecosystems destroyed. When we enter silence, we begin to feel this suffering, to sense the cries of the earth beneath the noise of civilization. Compassion arises not from abstract concepts, but from this direct, silent awareness. We see that we are not separate from nature, but part of it, and in that recognition, we begin to care. Silence opens the heart to the suffering of all beings, expanding compassion beyond the human realm into the vast web of life. Furthermore, silence teaches compassion toward ourselves. Many of us live in constant self-criticism, judging ourselves for every mistake, comparing ourselves to others, pushing ourselves to meet impossible standards. The inner voice becomes harsh, unforgiving, cruel. But when we enter silence, that voice begins to soften. In silence, we encounter ourselves without judgment, without comparison. We realize that we, too, are suffering beings, longing for peace, for love, for understanding. Silence allows us to embrace ourselves with compassion, to forgive, to accept, to rest. Without this self-compassion, compassion for others remains incomplete, for we cannot give what we do not allow ourselves to receive. In Buddhist practice, metta, or loving kindness, often begins with silence. We sit quietly repeating phrases of goodwill. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I be free from suffering. From there the circle expands. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be free from suffering. This practice is not about words alone, but about the silent intention of the heart. The repetition of phrases helps focus the mind, but it is the silence between the words, the quiet radiance of presence, that carries the true compassion. Silence is the ground in which loving kindness grows, the medium through which compassion flows. It's important to note that silence as compassion is not avoidance. It is not the silence of ignoring, of refusing to engage, of suppressing truth. That kind of silence is harmful, for it denies connection and perpetuates suffering. True compassionate silence is active presence. It is not withdrawal, but deeper engagement. It says, I see you, I hear you, I am with you. It is a silence filled with awareness, with empathy, with love. This is the silence of the Buddha, the silence of wisdom and compassion intertwined. In daily life, practicing silence as compassion may mean pausing before speaking harshly, choosing to listen instead of interrupting, allowing space for others to express themselves fully. It may mean holding back judgment, refraining from unnecessary criticism, and offering instead the silence of acceptance. It may mean sitting quietly with someone in pain, resisting the urge to fix, and simply being there. These small acts of silence carry immense power. They say to others what words cannot: you are not alone, you are valued, you are embraced. On a deeper level, silence as compassion transforms society. Much of the conflict in the world arises from the inability to listen, from the refusal to be silent. Nations argue, groups clash, individuals fight, all because no one pauses to hear. Compassionate silence could change this. If leaders listened more and spoke less, if communities sat in silence together before acting, if individuals paused in silence before reacting, the world would be gentler, kinder, more compassionate. Silence has the power to dissolve walls and build bridges, to heal divisions and foster unity. It is compassion not only for individuals, but for humanity as a whole. Ultimately, silence as compassion prepares the ground for liberation. Compassion is not only about easing suffering in the moment, but about guiding beings toward freedom from suffering altogether. Silence, in its depth, reveals the truth of impermanence, the illusion of self, the interdependence of all beings. When compassion is rooted in this silence, it becomes boundless. It is no longer limited to specific acts or individuals, but radiates to all existence. This is the compassion of the awakened mind, the compassion that embraces the world without condition. To sit in silence with compassion is to sit as the Buddha did, radiating love without words, offering presence without demand, embracing suffering without fear. It is to embody the truth that compassion is not something we create, but something we uncover, something that flows naturally when the noise of ego subsides. Silence is not the absence of compassion, but its fullest expression. For in silence, the heart speaks directly, beyond the barriers of language and thought. So let us practice silence not only for clarity, not only for healing, not only for learning, but also for loving. Let our silence be filled with compassion, for ourselves, for others, for the world. Let us sit in silence and listen deeply, hold gently, and love fully. For in silence, we discover that compassion is not something we do, but something we are. And as you reflect on this teaching, as you open your heart to the compassion that silence awakens, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so that together we may continue exploring the wisdom of silence and the boundless compassion it reveals in every moment of life. Silence as liberation. Silence in its deepest essence is liberation. Liberation from the tyranny of thoughts, liberation from the compulsions of desire, liberation from the chains of fear, liberation from the restless search for meaning in external things. In Buddhist wisdom, liberation, nirvana, is not a place we go to, but a state we awaken to, a realization that suffering ceases when clinging ceases, that peace arises when the noise of illusion falls away. Silence is the gateway through which this realization becomes possible. To enter silence fully is to enter freedom, for silence reveals that the self we cling to is an illusion, that the world we grasp is impermanent, and that the truth we seek is already here, waiting in the stillness of our own awareness. When we speak of silence as liberation, we are not speaking of external quietness alone, but of the inner silence that transcends words, concepts, and mental constructions. This silence is beyond dualities, beyond thought, beyond the restless movement of the mind. It is the silence that remains when all striving ends, when all seeking ceases. The Buddha described nirvana as the blowing out of the flame of craving, the cooling of the fires of attachment and aversion. Silence is the living expression of this state. It is the peace that arises when the mind no longer fights with reality, when it no longer clings to what passes or resists what comes. Silence is liberation, because in silence the illusions of self, time, and separation dissolve, and what remains is pure awareness, boundless and free. To experience silence as liberation, we must first recognize the prison of noise in which most people live. The noise of constant thought, the noise of desire for more, the noise of fear of loss, the noise of regret about the past, the noise of anxiety about the future. This noise chains us to samsara, the endless cycle of suffering. We may think we are free, but as long as we are driven by noise, we are bound. Silence cuts through these chains. It shows us that thoughts are not reality, that desires are not necessities, that fears are not truths. In silence, we are no longer slaves to the mind. We become masters of it. This mastery is not control but release, not domination but freedom. Consider how often people live imprisoned by their own minds. They wake up already consumed by thoughts, spend the day lost in them, and fall asleep still tangled in them. They are rarely present, rarely at peace, rarely free. Silence breaks this cycle. When we learn to rest in silence, we step outside the prison of thought and glimpse the vastness of awareness. We realize that we are not our thoughts, but the space in which thoughts arise and pass. This realization is liberating, for it shows us that the mind's noise is not our identity, but a passing phenomenon. Silence liberates us from identification with thought, revealing the spacious freedom of pure awareness. This liberation is not abstract. It changes how we live. When we are silent within, we are no longer controlled by desire. We may still experience wanting, but it does not dominate us. We see it arise, we see it pass, and we remain free. We are no longer driven by fear. Fear may still appear, but it no longer chains us, for we see it as a thought, a sensation, not as reality. We are no longer consumed by regret or anxiety, for silence teaches us that the past is gone and the future is not yet. All that exists is now, and in the now we are free. This is liberation, not escape from life, but freedom within it, the ability to live fully without being enslaved by the mind's illusions. Silence, as liberation, also reveals the truth of impermanence. In silence, we observe everything arising and passing, thoughts, emotions, sensations, even the sense of self. Nothing remains. This observation could lead to despair if we clung to permanence, but in silence it becomes liberation. We see that suffering arises from clinging to what changes, from resisting the flow of life. When we release clinging, when we allow everything to come and go without resistance, we discover freedom. Silence teaches us to flow with impermanence rather than fight against it, and in that flow we are liberated. Another dimension of silence as liberation is the dissolution of the self. The self we believe in so strongly, the I that seeks, fears, desires, is in Buddhist understanding a construct, a collection of thoughts and memories. In silence, when the mind becomes still, this construct dissolves. We experience awareness without a center, consciousness without an I. This is frightening to the ego, but it is liberation to the soul. To realize that we are not a separate self, but awareness itself is to be free from the endless burden of defending, protecting, and promoting the self. Silence liberates us from the illusion of separateness, revealing our unity with all beings, our oneness with existence. This realization has profound implications. When we are liberated from the illusion of self, compassion flows naturally, for we no longer see ourselves as separate from others. Their suffering is our suffering. Their joy is our joy. In silence, we realize that the boundaries we defended so fiercely were illusions, and in their dissolution, love becomes boundless. This is why silence is liberation. It frees us not only individually but collectively. It dissolves the walls that divide us, revealing the interconnectedness of all life. Liberation through silence also extends to time. The mind lives in past and future, rarely in the present. It clings to memories, regrets, and traumas, or it projects fears and hopes into the future. This creates suffering, for the past cannot be changed and the future cannot be controlled. Silence liberates us from this tyranny of time. In silence, we discover the eternal present, the now that is always here. The past dissolves, the future vanishes, and all that remains is this moment. To live in this moment is to live in freedom. It is to realize that peace is not in the past or the future, but in the silence of now. This timeless silence is described in many Buddhist texts as the unconditioned, the reality that is not born and does not die, that is beyond change. To touch this silence is to touch nirvana. It cannot be explained, for words belong to the conditioned, but it can be experienced in silence. This is why the Buddha often remained silent when asked about ultimate reality. Silence was the truest answer, for the truth cannot be spoken, only realized. Liberation is not a theory, but a direct experience of silence. The journey to silence as liberation requires practice, for the mind resists silence. It clings to noise, to distraction, to thought. Meditation is the training ground, teaching us to return again and again to silence, to rest in awareness, to let go of clinging. Over time, the practice deepens, and silence becomes more than a practice. It becomes our natural state. We carry silence into daily life, into conversations, into actions. We live from silence, not from noise. This is liberation, not a distant goal, but a way of being, a life lived in silence. The liberated silence is not passive, but dynamic. It is not emptiness, but fullness, not void, but presence. In silence, creativity arises, wisdom emerges, Love flows. Everything we sought in noise, we find in silence, and we realize it was within us all along. This realization frees us from the endless chase, from the restless seeking. We no longer look outside for peace, for meaning, for happiness. We discover it in silence, in the depth of our own being. This discovery is liberation, the end of suffering, the awakening of truth. Silence as liberation also means freedom from death. The greatest fear of humanity is the fear of death, the end of the self. But in silence, when we realize that the self is an illusion, death loses its sting. We see that what dies is only the body, the form, the construct of self. Awareness itself is not born and does not die. It is the silence that remains before birth and after death. To realize this is to be liberated from the fear of death, to live fully in the present without dread of the end. This is perhaps the greatest liberation silence offers, freedom from mortality's grip. In the end, silence as liberation is the culmination of the path. It is the fruit of clarity, healing, teaching, and compassion. Each dimension of silence leads to this, the realization that in silence we are free, free from suffering, free from illusion, free from fear. Silence is not merely a tool or a practice. It is the essence of liberation itself. To embrace silence is to embrace nirvana, to awaken to the truth that has always been here, waiting in the stillness of our own awareness. As you walk this path, remember that silence is not something you must create, but something you must uncover. It is already here, beneath the noise, beneath the striving, beneath the illusions. Sit quietly, listen deeply, and discover the silence that is your true nature. In that silence, you will find liberation, not as an idea, but as a living reality. And as you continue this journey, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, so that together we may keep exploring the boundless freedom that silence offers, the liberation that is the heart of Buddhist wisdom.